acting governor of the state today.
Pam, here,
So
Bill. Today it's Governor McGeachin, and we will get to some of the decorum and other procedures for the committee as we go. But I wanted to officially let you all know that when she is the acting governor, she has to be invited down to the garden level. And so last night I formally sent her office a letter requesting her attendance at the committee hearing today. So I really appreciate her being here, taking the lead on this task force, and I'm going to turn it back over to her to get started. And I may just make one initial note for you committee members. I've had a couple people ask. So right now you can see the red light is on, and at the bottom of your microphone there's a little toggle switch. And when you have a question, if you just, when you turn that toggle switch on, the red light lights up, and then we can see that you have a question or you're ready to go. And as we get into the introductions, that's also how you turn on your microphone. So, Governor McGee.
Thank you so much, Representative Giddings, for that warm introduction. And I just want to say a few words, a few opening remarks about this effort, what this is all about. Back in April 8th, my office put out a press statement discussing the formation of this task force to examine indoctrination in Idaho education and to protect our young people from the scourge of critical race theory, socialism, communism, and Marxism. So that's what the press release that went out on the 8th of April. Since that time, we've had a lot of interest in this task force. We put out a call to action for people that wanted to serve on the committee. We received interest from over 40 people, and then we also established a hotline in the Lieutenant Governor's office for people, the citizens of Idaho, to weigh in and offer their thoughts and their observances. And we have had a tremendous response from the people of Idaho on this issue. And so and Representative Giddings will speak to this a little bit more, but we're here to become educated about these important issues and to discuss and make sure that we all understand what it is that's being discussed. So that's the purpose of this committee, and I wanted to thank all of the committee members. The process that we went through to select members on the committee, we had some extensive set of questions. Each person was called, and what we tried to do was get representation from across the state and also representation from different walks of life. And so I want to just say to all of the committee members that are here today, I can't express to you my appreciation for your willingness as citizens of Idaho to come on your own time and your own expense to be a part of this committee. It's quite a humbling experience to know that because of your heartfelt concern about our state, that you're here and willing to serve and step forward. So my thank you to all the committee members. I would like to review rules of decorum before we start. And actually, if Piercy, I also wanted to thank Piercy Robinson, who did serve as an intern for our office, and she is here taking notes, and she will call the roll. And I also wanted to recognize Brooke Berry, who is also an intern in our office, a student at BSU, and we really appreciate both of you for being here and helping us put together all these details of the committee. So, Piercy, if you want to go ahead and call roll.
Okay, when I read your name, please say here. Janice McGeachin.
Here.
Priscilla Giddings.
Here.
Dr. Scott Yenner.
Here.
Anna Miller.
Here.
Isaac Moffett.
Here.
Sonia Harris.
Here.
Elaine King.
Here.
Jason Knott.
Here.
Joseph Kren.
Here.
Karen McGee.
Here.
Reverend James Wilson.
Here.
Janet Adams.
Here.
Mark Hand,
Here.
Michael Nelson,
Here.
Ryan Spoon,
Here.
and Laura Van Voorhees.
All right, we've got a full house here today, so I'm gonna just, before turning the time back over to Representative Giddings, I am going to review some rules of decorum for the public today. And this is something that is very important in this legislative process. We're not proposing anything today, but when we are in the legislative process, it's very important that the citizens of Idaho are able to feel that their voice is being heard in a respectful manner. And so there are rules of decorum that I will review at this time, and I just ask those that are here present today that as we have presenters that are presenting to the committee, to just please remember to be respectful of the people that are testifying. And we, as I said, we're not making any action today, but when there is an opportunity for that, we will give full due process to the people to be voice to be heard. So some rules for you to please consider. Each person that is testifying before a committee shall state his or her name, who they represent, and their special interest in the matter being heard. There are no food or drinks permitted in the auditorium. Please silence your cell phone. All questions or comments must be directed through the committee chair. So that might be new for some of the committee members, just when you do want to speak. When you turn your button on your microphone on, we can see the red light. And so if you say, Madam Chair, we will recognize you, and then you would make your comments through us. The committee chair shall be referred to as Madam Chair. No one is to disturb another in a speech by hissing, coughing, spitting, speaking, or whispering to another. No demonstrations or clapping. No person may use indecent language with reference to the body or its members. In debate, a person must confine remarks to the question before the House and avoid personalities. It is not the person but the measure that is the subject of debate, and it is not allowable to arraign the motives of a member, but the nature or consequences of a measure may be condemned in strong terms. Any person who willfully disrupts a meeting to the extent that orderly conduct is seriously compromised may be removed. And the committee chair may set time limits for the purpose of giving all interested parties opportunity to testify within a given time frame, if the time constraints are applied equally to all participants. So with that, a little rule of the expectation of the rules of decorum, I will turn the discussion back over to Representative Giddings.
Thank you, Madam Governor. All right, the goal of the task force for today is we just want to define what critical race theory is and social justice ideology, and then over that, critical theory in general. And so when you look at the agenda, there's going to be lots of discussion about really capturing it with a definition. The task force is going to meet 3 additional times, the last Thursday in June, July, and August. The following meeting, we're really going to dig into K through 12 and then higher education and have examples. We're going to hear testimony from the community and teachers. And then the last meeting, we're going to come together as a committee and really focus on some courses of action and some recommendations that we have. So I think it's going to be very productive, and it's going to be great for our communities, for the state of Idaho, and I'm looking forward to it. The next thing that we want to do is introductions around the committee. So we have about 40 minutes until we get started into the content. We'd like to start, and just if you would shortly introduce yourself, and I think we will start down here on the end, and then we'll just go through the whole back row, and then we'll come forward to you across. If you just quickly share your background and maybe your expertise and why you volunteered to serve on the committee.
My name is Ryan Spoon, and my representation is here representing only myself as an Idaho voter. And my special interest in this task force is as a father of young school children.
Ryan, will you do it just, I did say short, and you are a West Point grad, and so I appreciate that, sir. If you don't mind, if you would just maybe give a little bit more about your background, I may have spilled the beans there, but so that people know your caliber.
Yes, Representative Giddings, we've been trained to conceal that at times. It's not always well received. So yes, I did attend the United States Military Academy at West Point from 1994 to 98. I served as an active duty Army officer. And at the time, there was nothing like critical race theory at the Federal Service Academies. And I have heard from my fellow Army officers that are instructors there and people that have cadets attending the Federal Service Academies that everything from critical race theory to socialism and everything in between has infiltrated those institutions, and those are being taught to our future Army officers, our future leaders. And in many ways, the military is being transformed or remade before our eyes in a very frightening way. And that is my motivation for serving on this task force.
All right, my name is Sonia Harris. I'm from Blackfoot. I was born and raised in Idaho, and I raised my 4 children in Idaho. They attended public schools. I taught for 10 years in public schools, and I'm currently serving on my local school board. I was interested in serving on this task force because I'm very interested in making sure that the students in my own district are presented with material and education that is the best quality.
Good afternoon, my name is Janet Adams. I live in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. I resided there since 1999, where I had a private law practice dealing in family law. I am now retired. Raised a daughter, went to high school in Moscow, Idaho. I went to the University of Idaho Law School. And my interest in serving on this task force was that as a retired person, I've been sitting back and not really getting involved in what's going on in our state. And I thought it was time that I put myself forward because I have opinions about what our children are being taught, how they're being taught, and that was why I decided to volunteer and asked to sit on this committee.
Good afternoon. My name is Mark and I live in Nez Perce, the town of Nez Perce, which is in Lewis County. I retired from the Marine Corps 2016. Spent 3 years in retirement, and that's what I called it. And then I went back to school, studied social work for 2 years, and got my license last year in social work. When we're conservative folks, my family, my parents, my wife's parents, they're salt of the earth type of citizens, good Christian folks, raise their kids well. When I went to school in Walla Walla, I actually had to sit through a privilege and impression class. And the things I heard in that class, they didn't surprise me, but very unfortunate that those things are being taught. And so, I did the privilege walk, and of course I was identified as being privileged. Throughout that 2-year period, nearly every class I took threw people like my parents under the bus and linked the problems in our society to people like my parents and my wife's parents in traditional values. So that's concerning to me. I suspect in our local school, the content isn't there. We have a great school up there in Nez Perce, but it's close. I can guarantee you that. And so I'm here to participate in this committee. I'm happy to be here, and I really hope we can accomplish our goals.
Good afternoon, I'm Jim Wilson, AKA the Reverend James, but James is perfectly fine. I wanted to be on this committee because I've been an educator for the last 50 years. I taught in California public schools for about a dozen years before becoming ordained pastor. and have taught inside and outside the church since then. I care deeply about teaching children how to think, not what to think. There's a vast difference between the two philosophies. I'd also like to say, and this is especially for the media, just for the record, because I got an awful lot of ink in the education news, and more than I deserved. I do not live in Moscow, Idaho. In fact, I've never been there. I'm not in my 90s. I hope. I did not write a book called Principles of War, although I have read it about 25 years ago. But and I do have a son, but his name is not Douglas. He does not live in Idaho, and he has no desire to take over a city. I do want to be a part of the solution. My ministry, I've led a parachurch ministry called Pray More State for the last 20 plus years. And it's all about reconciliation. It is not about retribution or retaliation. Anything that I can do to be a part of reconciliation, I'm all over it. I do not want to be a part of a foul philosophy that simply says hatred is all we'll ever have and all we'll ever need. That's why I'm here. And God bless you all.
Good afternoon. My name is Jason Knopp. I've been a trustee on my local school in Malta for 8 years. I've served on the ISBA board for 6, currently president-elect of that association. Represented approximately 900 trustees and charter board members across the state of Idaho. I wanted to be on this board to represent them and to take information back to my body from this and see where we go.
Good afternoon, my name is Elaine King and I am from Madison County. I've raised my 5 children in Sugar Salem School District. Prior to that, I retired as an elementary school teacher in Utah. I got my degree in California, and I've been interested in education for many, many years. I've been an algebra tutor for the last several years and retired from that as well. I'm concerned about what is being taught in our elementary schools in American history, and I believe we need to address that subject. I'm concerned about some of the teaching, the training that is being given to teachers on CRT and how that's being implemented in our elementary grades. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Laura Van Voorhees. I've gotten interested in this task force because I've been doing this investigation of this issue for some time now. I recognized several years ago that there was a problem in our universities, and at the time, a couple years ago, I recognized there was a problem there because I sent my wonderful daughter off to Sac State. She was involved in the criminal justice program, wanted to go into FBI as during Obama, and they shut down the intern program, and so that squelched her dreams for that. But when she graduated, she started telling me things like, you know, if you're, and we'd always gotten along, we'd never had any problems, but she started telling me things like, if I ever get married, you're not invited to the wedding, nor is her brother. And I, you know, who are you? And I don't think I should have any children because there's too many kids already. So I'm going, I don't even know who this person is anymore. That was just the beginning. Not to mention how many we shouldn't be using straws and plastics and just on and on, every talking point. And so after I lost her, I had to understand it. And I had taught in the schools for 11 years. I was, for all practical purposes, a single mom. And when I was raising my kids, and I wanted to be home after school every single day with them because I recognized that kids that didn't have a mom at home were the ones getting into trouble. I'm a retired sheriff's deputy, and I started a program in Sacramento County that took kids that got into trouble and introduced them to their victims. And so I knew from that experience that these kids didn't have a mom at home, and so or they're latchkey kids. And so I wanted to be part of the solution, not the problem. And so anyway, after I recognized that I lost my daughter, I haven't talked to her in a couple of years now, which absolutely breaks my heart, I had to do something about it. When we moved to Kootenai County, I found out before I moved there, I was in Seattle, and the horrors of CHOP and all the things that were going on over there. So I'm a refugee from California and from Washington State. So I've only been in Idaho a couple months, but I started to investigate prior to moving, what's going on in Kootenai County. And I found out that they have, as far as I'm concerned, total Marxists developing curriculum in Kootenai County. And this is some of the, just one pillar, equity framework that's just loaded with all this psychobabble talk that they use to disguise what really is critical race theory and critical theory. So it's equity framework, it's socio-emotional frameworks, and they not only have the kids, the students on their bullseye to indoctrinate, but they're planning to indoctrinate the parents and the whole community, getting community partners involved. So I'm raising the alarm for the kids of Kootenai County, and hopefully this will be a siren call for the whole state and hopefully for the whole nation. And I think we have the, that's my hope for this task force. And so that's it. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Karen McGee. I'm from Pocatello, Idaho. Raised 3 kids in the public schools in Pocatello. Very happy with their education. I'm a master's degree in speech pathology and have continued PhD courses in education to see what the education department is like. I felt it was very important. Served on the State Board of Education and found out through that how important it is to have discussions throughout the state, not only with educators, but with parents, because people have to know what's going on. One of the things we did on the state board was to write the charter legislation so parents had the right to go to charter schools. It seemed like it was very contentious. What it ended up was, I think, a great partnership. And I've talked to parents that have kids in charter schools and like the fact that they have a choice. I think it's very important that parents know what their children are being taught. And so I was very excited to be a part of this discussion, to be a part of the discussion in my community, and I'm looking forward to hearing from everyone throughout Idaho.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joseph Kren. I am from Old Town, Idaho. I recently retired after serving the students and the teachers of this great state for the past 34 years. I started out as a teacher and principal at the Idaho School for the Deaf and Blind in Gooding, and then had the opportunity to move around the state a little bit and served as a superintendent in the North Gem School District down in Southeast Idaho. And then I moved up to North Idaho and served in the Potlatch School District and then St. Mary's. And as our daughter moved into high school, and it was towards the end of my career, I saw a great opportunity to visit with my daughter, harass my daughter on a daily basis in the building. So I went back into the building as a building principal, closer to the kids. Over my 34 years as an educator, I have grown to know and love the teachers and the students of this great state. I've had the opportunity to celebrate with them all. I've had the opportunity to help them grow. I even have had the opportunity, while it may have been uncomfortable, to let some people go that weren't quite cutting it, that weren't doing what was needed to be done for our students. So I believe in the educational system in this great state. I believe in our teachers, I believe in our students. I believe in this state to come together to make sure that we all do what's right for our students. So, I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to learning. I'm looking forward to hearing what everyone has to say. I appreciate the idea that we are here to learn, and I look forward to seeing where this committee goes. But I also want to make sure that everyone has a voice where it's necessary. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Nelson, and I have been a police officer for 25 years in a major metropolitan city of California, San Francisco. I retired as a lieutenant there, and I worked in some of the most poorest areas of the city for most of my career. I see what bad politics can do to an area, to people, to children, and what I want to do for this committee is help the best I can to work with the citizens of Idaho to make sure that the education system in this state is the best we can possibly offer for our children. Because indoctrination is not the way to educate our children. I would like to see them educated so that they can have a future, so they can get jobs, whether it's a basic job, carpentry, police officer, or whether it's at the college level and higher through that type of education. I didn't realize I was going to have to speak publicly today, so I didn't prepare anything, but thank you all for coming here, and I appreciate your attention.
Hi everyone, I'm Anna Miller. I'm the Education Policy Director at the Idaho Freedom Foundation. I'm a policy researcher and I'm an economist. I graduated from graduate school at George Mason University with my master's in economics in 2020. I have about 5 years of experience in policy research, everything from technology policy to healthcare policy, education policy, and I've spent the last year evaluating Idaho's higher education system.
Thank you. I guess that shows what kind of technology person I am. My name is Scott Yenner. I am a professor of political science here in the Valley, and I am a Washington Fellow of the Claremont Institute Center for the American Way of Life. I moved to Idaho in 2000 after I earned my PhD in political science at Loyola University of Chicago. I'm a son of Wisconsin, and but I'm proud to live here in Idaho. I've written 4 books. The most recent book is called The Recovery of Family Life. It's available online. And in my research into that book, I spent a lot of time with the authors of the critical theories, Herbert Marcuse, Michel Foucault, and the others, to really kind of get inside what their thinking was and their worldview, and it's that understanding of that framework that got me very interested in how that has made its way into not just education, but into many of the facets of our lives, and whether or not that particular ideology is something that is sustainable for any political community, much less an education system. So I'm interested in the education question, but not only in the education question, and so I'm thankful for the opportunity to be on the task force, and I'll turn it over to Isaac.
All right, thank you. My name is Isaac Moffitt. I'm currently an administrator at a secondary school. I have my EDS degree from NNU in administration with emphasis in superintendency, and have my Idaho certification all the way up through superintendency. And I'm here to hope to lend some voice, as well as to learn what is happening out there in the schools in the broader realm.
Excellent. Thank you all. Thank you for sharing your story and for being here today. In front of you, I want to also show you, I have we'll call it a gift for you. So I got these for each member. 2 different books here. One, How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi, and 2, Cynical Theories by Mr. James Lindsay, who we'll hear from later today, and Helen Pluck-Rose. I wanted you to have resources that shared both sides of the topic. I think when we're addressing philosophical differences, it is so important that we know and understand both sides of the issue. So please, read them in your spare time and use these as resources as we go forward. I'd like to now just transition into a quick status of where we are as a state when it comes to budgeting and legal policy. And as I do that, Professor Yenner, if I would go ahead and clear you off from the committee, if you could take your position up front and get ready to start your presentation. Yes, sir. And so while I'm sharing, you can get ready to go, and we're gonna move right into Dr. Yenner's presentation. We're a little bit ahead of schedule, but I think that will be good, and then we will be able to go into some questions and discussion, and we'll also have time for a break. I can maybe pause for a second. Do any of the committee members have any questions yet? Great, thank you. Okay, so I wanted to give a quick overview of what happened this year in the legislative session. So I serve on the budget committee, and we first saw signs of critical theory coming in through the budget process. Initially, there was a early childhood development grant where critical theory was being promoted. And then we started hearing about examples in K through 12. I personally received examples from some substitute teachers in the local valley. And then we also had a lot of concerns for it being taught and advocated for in higher education. So there was a deep dive into how much money was being spent in higher education. Initial indications, we saw about $20 million being spent specifically on social justice ideology here in Idaho. With the initial childhood grant, we were able to kill it in the House, so to stop the teaching of critical race theory. And then we were able to pause the other K through 12 education budgets while legislators worked together to pass a bill that would stop some of the critical race theory in our education. And I'm pulling up that bill specifically because I'm gonna have a copy of it all for you after when we have the break, so you can reference it as we're going through this. And once we as the state of Idaho really led the way on that legislation, and it put a pause on what we can do in our education here in Idaho, but there are still some concerns, and so I think that's something that we will also address with the committee. And let's see, with that, how are you doing, Professor? You about ready?
I'm always ready.
You're always ready.
Except to turn things on. I guess now I'm ready.
Then I will go ahead and Dr. Yenner, he introduced himself just a minute ago. He's going to start his presentation on social justice education over the last 50 years and how did we get here. And I want the committee, as we're really identifying this, to be thinking of how you personally would define critical race theory. And I think we're gonna have an active exercise later so that we as a committee can maybe come together and have a solid definition. So with that, Professor Yenner.
All right, well, thank you, Madam Chairman, and I appreciate the chance to do this. It's always dangerous to give a professor a microphone and unlimited time, or at least more time than he was expecting. But, so what I'm gonna try to do today is just talk to the committee and to the people present about where critical race theory has come from. And I'm gonna try to give maybe a history of civil rights in the last 50 years, since the Civil Rights Act in a way too. I think in order to situate the contemporary understanding or problem of critical race theory. So here goes. Critical race theory seemed to come like a fire bell in the night. It was adopted all over by corporations, statements in allegiance to those who adopted critical race theory came from school districts and elite schools, Tony elite schools all over the country. And conservatives started to see it as a threat. People on the left started to see it as a great opportunity and an instance of progress. Policies started to pop up in the waning days of the Trump administration. There were bans put on trainings on critical race theory. Immediately when the Biden administration came in, they reinstated, or I should say rescinded those executive orders of the Trump administration. So something's up, and it seems like an important thing. But I want to maybe tamp it down a little bit and before building it up, because there's a lot of names for these things, and there's a lot of things, a lot of ideologies floating around. We hear things about critical race theory. We hear things about critical theory. We hear things about identity politics. We hear things about cultural Marxism or social justice or multiculturalism. And what I'm going to try to argue is that that's all the same old song. Those are all the same ideologies because they boil down to one, maybe two very simple propositions. And then they have different kind of dressings around those simple propositions. And the simple proposition is what I'm going to call, over the course of my time, the reigning civil rights ideology. And I'm going to keep talking, using those words, the reigning civil rights ideology. Our reigning civil rights ideology is based on the idea that all disparities between groups are traceable to discrimination. And that those disparities would disappear under conditions of genuine liberation.
Professor Yenner, I'm gonna just ask you to pause, please, sir. Then we're just gonna ask that all signs be removed from the committee room. So if you have a sign, if you'd go ahead and please just take it out to the back of the room.
That would be you.
Free speech.
Anti-free speech in the class.
All right, thank you.
We'll have order in the committee room, please. No applauding. Thank you. All right, and go ahead and carry on.
All right, thank you. So just to review, I guess, where we were, our reigning civil rights ideology is made up of these two propositions. One, that all disparities are traceable to discrimination, and that those disparities would vanish under conditions of genuine liberation. Now, there is a lot to unpack in these two propositions, and my goal is to unpack it. This idea, our reigning civil rights ideology, has been around and really has been governing policy in this country for over 50 years. It contains a radical critique of our free institutions and some of our really necessary institutions. There's not that much special about critical race theory, as opposed to these other schools of thought. They all boil down to those two propositions. They are all animated by our reigning civil rights ideology. And I think the question for us, the most important question for us, is why are they now winning the day? They've been around for 50 years, why now? So I'm gonna try to give an account of that. We'll see how it goes. So first of all, I have to remember I'm front back on the printing. So I want to try to, as I say, unpack those principles of our reigning civil rights ideology. And once again, I'm trying to do this based on a very sympathetic understandings of the writings of those like Kendi and Marcuse, who have articulated these things over the course of time. So this is going to sound weird, but I'm taking our reigning civil rights ideology. It's made up of 5 different things when you look at it. First of all, it contains the contention that our free institutions and ideas are infused with racism, sexism, homophobia. They appear to be neutral, but they're really infused with these secret ideologies. Second, that all of those institutions, like equal protection of the laws, are really masks for power structures in law and opinion that oppress disfavored minorities and privilege dominant groups. They oppress disfavored minorities, blacks, immigrants, women, homosexuals, Muslims, etc. And they privilege dominant groups, white, male, heterosexual, Christians, and by the way, 4 for 4 for me. And so that's the second proposition. Third, the oppressors are fundamentally and irredeemably evil, while the victims of the oppression are good and pure. Third, a transformation in the country could only come about by dismantling and stigmatizing the institutions of the oppressor class and weakening its will to continue the old ways. And then fifth, a new world of social justice will be characterized by equity, diversity, and inclusion once that old order collapses. If you take these 5 propositions, you can explain almost every controversy that happens in our culture wars. Take, for example, the recent effort, I think successfully adopted in California, to drop the SAT from admission standards in higher education. SAT looks like a meritocratic institution. It looks like it's judging people based on their aptitude, which is what the A stands for. It's a particular kind of aptitude. It's scholastic. It looks like it, but there end up being racial discrimination, or racial disparities in the test results. Asians do better than whites. Whites do better than Latinos. And Latinos do better than blacks. And these disparities have continued really since it's been administered. So it looks like it's objective and neutral, but it ends up giving rise to disparities. How are we to understand those disparities? They could be traceable to different priorities, they could be traceable to different family structures. I would argue that those things are actually important in understanding those disparities. But those critics, those adopters of the civil rights ideology, say that it's traceable to discrimination. That is, the results of the test reflect systems of oppression that the disfavored groups have had to suffer from. Poorer schools, poorly funded schools, poorer families, all of that is part of the system that gives rise to disparities. So what must be done? Next stage, number 4, that old test admission processes need to be transformed. They need to be transformed and dropped. And new admission standards, we'll call them socially just admission standards, must be adopted. And so we're not going to have a holistic account of who comes into universities and who is not allowed to come into universities. So just that one controversy with the SAT being dropped by the California higher ed and other institutions of higher education around the country, you see all the marks of all the principles of our reigning civil rights ideology manifest. And it doesn't only apply to race, it applies to many things. It applies to sexual disparities. This is kind of where I do most of my research on this matter. But just to give an example, why are there so few women engineers? Well, it looks like the admission process to becoming an engineer is an objective one. There are criteria to get in, there are classes to get in. You can just choose to be an engineer or not choose to be an engineer. All of that choice seems to be a neutral principle. But we end up seeing that 80% of engineers in almost every kind of engineering are men, and 20% are women. That must be traceable to systems of oppression, or systems of patriarchy, as they might say in feminist literature. They would say things like this: girls are discouraged from math. They would say that math teachers try to channel them into different kinds of professions instead of math. That they've been encouraged by their families to play with people and not things. And all of the accumulation of all those different experiences, which could have been different, equals the 80-20 disparity, and it's traceable to that patriarchal socialization that they have suffered over the course of their lives. What to do? Transformation. Transformation of the engineering profession so it's more friendly to those with different talents, maybe less math-oriented, more personal, in order to bring people in. And then we will have social justice engineering. Whether a bridge would stand up is another question. It's nevertheless the approach that you see on all of these disparities, and I could really go into them, like almost every facet, as I say, of the culture war is fought on these grounds. And once you see this reigning civil rights ideology, once you identify it, you can see it everywhere. You can see how deeply embedded those ideas have been in our culture and our language for almost all of our lives. So what's in a name? We call it critical race theory or critical theory today, but all those theories are critical. They're all critical. Identity politics is critical, multiculturalism is critical. Because what does critical mean? Critical means that what appears to be true is not really true. It's a mask. It hides a genuine reality of power structures or power differentials. Critical theory is really only different in two ways, I would say. First, it is more pervasive. It doesn't limit itself to race and sex, as almost all of the other versions did. It expands to other areas, and you'll see this in the Lindsay book. It expands itself to things like fact studies and disability studies. It explains disability in terms of critical theory. And really, no one had done that before it was applied. And then the second way is that I think it's a little bit more radical on the back end, but I don't think that that's really a difference in principle. I think it's just a difference in kind of time sequence, which I'll get to as we go forward. So I'm going to be referring to it as our reigning civil rights ideology, not critical theory, and I'll conclude by calling it social justice ideology for a reason that I'll give you later on. But right now I want to track the rise of our reigning civil rights ideology. For many of us, this is the story of our lives. It's the story of what's happened over the course of our lives. Once again, I'm just going to try to explain it and try to be historically accurate in doing it because there's really no reason to make it up. So, and I think the story about where it comes from starts in 1964 with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. There was a genuine debate about the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Of course, there was a previous debate on whether or not it should pass, but once it passed, there were two pervasive readings of the Civil Rights Act of 1984. One reading suggested that only individual discrimination was made illegal by the Civil Rights Act. So a person who owns a hotel would not rent to a black man. He would have violated the civil rights of that black man, and therefore he would be subject to the oversight and fines from the EEOC, the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission, or something akin to that. Others thought, and this happened almost immediately, that when there are disparities between groups, the Civil Rights Act is triggered. And the debate between those who interpreted the Civil Rights Act on an individualistic basis and those who interpreted it on a, we'll call it the reigning civil rights basis, continued for about 4 years. But in 1968, the Equal Opportunity Employment and other agencies of the government got behind our reigning civil rights ideology. And this came about in various different ways. In hiring, it led to racial quotas or goals and timetables. In contracting, it led to minority and women set-aside programs so that they would, as they say, have an opportunity. In higher education, it led to admission quotas, initially affirmative action as the leading edge of this reform. And at each stage, the United States Supreme Court blessed those interpretations. The United States Supreme Court got behind set-asides, got behind hiring quotas, got behind affirmative action. But in K through 12 education, our reigning civil rights ideology came in a different form. It came in the form of what they called, its advocates called, multiculturalism. And since education is our emphasis, I think it's probably something we need to talk about in some detail because this is not well understood. there is a gap between the races in education. How are we to understand it? That's the question. The old idea, and I might even say the old liberal idea, is that the gap in education between blacks and the rest of the population is caused by what was called cultural deprivation. What cultural deprivation meant is that they had been kept outside the mainstream of American society by discrimination laws, by discriminatory practices, and racial attitudes. And efforts need to be made to bring them up to the level of the rest of the country. Blacks did poorly in math education, so they need remedial programs. Black children were more likely to have families that weren't intact, so they needed preschool or Head Start. This was an attempt to make up for their cultural deprivation. As I say, that's the old understanding. Advocates came to believe that the idea that blacks were culturally deprived was blaming the victim. It implied that black culture was inferior. So they put forward a new model to understand the gap. And that new model they called cultural difference. The father of multicultural education, whose works are little known but very important, is a man named James Banks. Here's what he says about difference and deprivation. The cultural difference paradigm, which he advocated for, maintains that ethnic minority youths often do not achieve well in school, not because they have a deprived culture, but because their cultures are different from the culture of the school. The school should therefore, and here's the key words, modify the education environment to make it more consistent with the cultures of the ethnic minority, end quote. The cultural difference paradigm demands the modification of the education environment. We're not going to demand that people rise to the level of the civilization as it existed before. We're going to try to respect each civilization equally with its limits and with its promises. And the school must be rearranged in order to achieve such things. Now, respecting cultural difference, that's a big-time project. It's very ambitious. I would say it's an endless project. I would even say that it's a rolling revolution in the practices of everything that happens within a school. They might start by celebrating minorities, adopting things like Black History Month, or Women's History Month, or Gay Pride Month. They might continue by deconstructing the old idea of achievement. They might stop teaching about the importance of family life or being on time, because that would suggest a lack of respect for cultural differences. And this cultural difference approach was really first adopted in states in the middle of the 1970s, in Iowa in 1975. It became central to the accreditation standards of schools by the early 80s. It's an approach that was around from, say, 75 until now. And it's been embedded in our practices for about 40 years. But there's a problem. It did not yield equality. The gaps remained. We respected cultural differences, we modified the education environments, but the gap persisted. And this is where critical theory comes in. The idea that the environment needed to be reconstructed has always been with us. But with critical theory, a more radical turn in the idea of reconstructing our environment comes to the fore. You can find, you can go back to the early, to the 1960s and find critics of imposing Western or white norms in family life onto the black community in America. That's always been considered a problem since the reigning civil rights ideology came about. No one ever suggested abolishing the family as a result, until basically 2018. And I think we have the Black Lives Matter About Us statement where they advocated abolishing the family. So the critique of holding minorities to the supposedly white standard has been around for, as I say, 50 years. But a more radical turn comes from critical theory, where they're taking the idea and they're more willing to abolish this, let us say family, the police, or something like that. Okay? So I think it's a more radical doctrine, but it grows naturally out of the soil that was tilled in the 40 years or so before it arose. And this leads us to what I think is the most difficult part of understanding and reacting to our reigning civil rights ideology today. It is very moralistic. We should never call it postmodern, never. It has a big time ethic that it is seeking to promote. It has a big time understanding of what the common good in a country is. It is not postmodern. Once again, let's go to James Banks. The major goal of multicultural education is to change the total education environment so that it promotes a respect for the wide range of cultural groups and enables all cultural groups to experience equal educational opportunities. All the buzzwords and the main concepts of our reigning civil rights ideology in the critical theory form are present in what James Banks says there. We could look at Mayor McLean's commission from last year and see all the buzzwords come from that. We can look at Boise State's Diversity Commission from 2017. We'd see all of these things. We can look at corporate trainings. We'd see all of these things traceable to what Banks is talking about, which is how to change the total environment so that it promotes respect. Sounds like a good idea. How do you change the total education environment? It seems like a big job. Today, there are several elements of our attempt to change the total education environment. Our new language will speak of diversity, equity, inclusion, identity, recognition, respect, and openness. These terms will infuse politics with a new morality. They will infuse our educational system with a new morality. We're going to drop the dry old language of liberalism, private versus public, and we're going to recognize that everything is public. And we're going to demand consistent behavior in terms of this new morality. As I say, it infuses our politics with a new morality. A morality that emphasizes these words: diversity, equity, inclusion, identity, recognition, respect, and openness. And this new moral politics may have problems. It may undermine civic friendship and political life, but we have to give it its due. They demand the common good. They speak the language of the common good. And it is my contention that opponents of critical theory must also speak the language of the common good in order to win the debate. So let us understand, insofar as we are able, to understand this new idea of the common good. I'm going to kind of do something backwards. I'm doing this spontaneously, so we'll see how this goes. There was a controversy in Canada, in a little village, that's very interesting and illustrative of, I think, the new understanding of the common good. This happened in 2007, but it can happen anywhere. It's just a very representative sample. Some refugees were being relocated by the Canadian government to this kind of local, this rural village. And it was very conservative, practicing Muslims. And the town folks decided to put up a newspaper ad telling them how to behave. And now, the newspaper ad went something like this: "We swim together, men and women, in public pools. And if you demand that we conform to, change our rules to respect your ways, we will not do it." Now, this is one of these classic examples. We try to be religiously tolerant, and we also want to uphold sexual equality. These two things come at loggerheads in this particular debate. And Canada didn't know what to do. So they named a big commission. And a big philosopher was the head of it. Can you believe that? They put a political philosophy guy in charge of some sort of task force, or on a task force. And so they established this task force, they put a political philosophy guy on top of it, and they sit here and wring their hands for 2 years trying to figure out what to do. And they end up saying, no, can't you both lose? Yes, there's a way you can both lose. We're gonna say that you shouldn't be so mean to them, and we're gonna say to the Muslims, you shouldn't be so sexually inegalitarian. But we're not gonna make either of you change. We're just gonna badger you. We're gonna change the curriculum in schools to try to get each of you to change. We're gonna fund interest groups that will pressure you to change. And we think that if we come back here in 50 years or 40 years, the Muslims will move closer to the residents of that rural town, and the residents of the rural town will move closer to respecting difference. And the hope was that with sufficient oversight, sufficient training, we can pursue the common good. And I think if you take that episode and you recognize Canada's response to it, you can understand what's going on with social justice education in America. Okay? It cultivates respect. It does this in a number of ways. We're going to give honor to those that we say have not been honored in the past. History months, Pride months. We're gonna stop celebrating the achievements of our own history as much. That will bring some up and bring some down. We're going to advocate for equity. Equity is often thought of as equal outcomes, and I think that that's kind of a halfway decent definition. We should really understand equity as equal status. Everyone will have equal status. And that means that the dominant group has to come to have less status. And that the formerly aggrieved groups must come to have more status. We're going to celebrate Sojourner Truth, but we'll ignore George Washington. We'll celebrate Florence Nightingale, but ignore Abe Lincoln. Equity means equal status. Diversity means the aggrieved get to make the rules in the name of the new common good. Inclusion means remaking the environment to be, as it said, more welcome, to give voice to diverse ethnic, racial, and language communities, and different sexual communities too. Now that might mean things like establishing special offices for formerly aggrieved minorities, such as an LGBTQ center on campus, or a women's center, or an African American studies program, or a Latinx studies program. It may mean that. It may mean decolonizing the curriculum, that is, making the books that are read less representative of the history of our tradition and more representative of minority voices. It may mean that, at some level, aggrieved minorities are beyond criticism, And those who criticize them might be told to shut up, or that they're in violation of community norms or shared values, or maybe, as happened in Canada, hate speech codes. So all of these words, they have a new moral content that reflect a new understanding of the common good. It's an ethic of diversity and inclusion. It is explicitly anti-freedom. It is explicitly anti-civilizational tradition. And it's this goal, this understanding of the common good, that is called social justice. The goal of all of these movements, identity politics, multiculturalism, critical race theory, critical theory, is social justice, understood as solving the problem of that rural Canadian community by decreasing the difference and encouraging more respect. Politically, how does social justice come into being? It's going to require administrative hectoring and a transformation of the education environment. Endless interest groups will be funded by the government to change those who need changing. And the goal will be, as I say, the achievement of social justice, where everyone drops their old ways and adopts the new way. Everyone will be more alike. It is not really open because it is closed to some. Now, what I would suggest is that we need to understand these standards of social justice in distinction with the standards of civilization. Standards of civilization include things, but this is not an exhaustive group, like the celebration of achievement, scientific discovery, the defense of the family, the defense of private property, the idea that contracts are the best basis to arrange an economy on, Christianity. Those are the standards of civilization. And under that view, the hope is to rise everyone to the level of civilization. The standards of social justice, in distinction with that, where we say diversity, respect, and inclusion are our watchwords, points toward a new vision of humanity where all these distinctive traits are dropped and human beings converge on their more basic level of humanity. And I would suggest, in closing, that civilization and social justice ideology are in endless conflict with one another. You can't have both. You have to choose. The people of Idaho have to choose, the people of the country have to choose, the people of Canada have to choose. But it's a big fork in the road, and it's good that the task force is here to investigate the nature of each path. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Professor Yenner. We're gonna step into some questions now of the committee. So I will start off. In a minute, we're gonna ask the committee to, or a little bit later, we're gonna ask the committee to define critical race theory. How do you define critical race theory?
It is an embodiment of the reigning civil rights ideology that holds that all disparities between groups are traceable to discrimination, and that if we end discrimination, those disparities would disappear. The precise nature of that discrimination is hidden, according to I think according to critical theory, it's a hidden thing. But I think that's something that it shares with all of those various schools of thought. So I would just, I would emphasize that it's the manifestation of our reigning civil rights ideology.
Committee, what questions you have for Dr. Yenner. Don't be bashful.
I have a question. Given that, it's my understanding that Derek Bell is the one that first came up or is credited with the inserting race into critical theory. How does your definition play with his definition?
Well, I think, so Derek Bell established first critical legal studies,
Right.
and then in the early 70s at Harvard, and then critical race studies, I think it was 1974 at Harvard. And the element in Bell's understanding that I didn't articulate, and I don't know that I think is representative of the whole, is this. That Bell thought that the quantity of racism in America was constant, and it always took a different form. So, if you want to think of it like under slavery, the United States was a 10 out of 10 on the racism scale. Under Jim Crow, the United States was 10 out of 10 on the racism scale. And in 1974, after the Civil Rights Act is passed, after there's equal opportunity employment, the United States is 10 out of 10 on the racial scale, and in 2020, it's 10 out of 10. That is, Bell denied the idea that there could ever be racial progress. And he denied, and this is the part that I don't want to, he denied that blacks could ever destroy the system of white oppression. So that there was actually no progress that could ever be made at the back end. In other words, he denied the second part of the reigning civil rights ideology, that if you destroy the system, you'd have genuine liberation. He seemed to think that you could never destroy the system. And he said this in a speech where he became Harvard president. In that speech, when he became Harvard president, this was in the early 90s, Bell said that there has been no racial progress in America since 1865. And in 1865, blacks were not admitted into Harvard. And when he said that, he was becoming the president of Harvard.
Isaac.
It sounds like they've got a 50-year head start on society. We've all grew up in this mindset. How do we start getting people to recognize that that's the matrix we're living in?
Well, we'll have to figure that out in number 4. I have ideas. I mean, the task force is one thing. It seems like the fact that the solutions to this problem are being framed in such a more radical way than they had been in the 70s and 80s, I would say, when I first was exposed to it. There's one thing to oppose affirmative action. You could give kind of conservative sounding arguments or constitutional sounding arguments in favor of affirmative action. You could say that we're making up for past discrimination or something like that. But when the policy is abolish the family and abolish the police, the more radical leading edge of it becomes more clear. And then I just think it's necessary to peel back and say, no, that the conclusion that they're reaching comes from premises that have been planted in our education system and our civil rights regime for 50 years. And it really requires it to be revisited.
Again, I'm going to say that it's going to sound like I'm not asking a question. I really am, but I need you to know where I'm coming from. The thing that I find most disturbing about critical race theory, according to a little bit of reading that I've done, is that whatever I am, whether I'm black, white, brown, whatever, it's not what I am, it's what somebody else says I am. The understanding is that it's a social or political construct. That is so deeply disturbing to me because, first of all, I'm not who I think I am, I'm who somebody else thinks I am. And the goalposts are forever movable because somebody else who thinks I am what I am can change his or her mind. I didn't hear you address that directly, but I bet you've got some things to say about it. That's my question. What do you have to say about that?
I mean, I think what you're saying is true. It does suggest, I mean, it's kind of like a footnote to the idea that no progress can take place, that is, that there can be no genuine change. I mean, I consider that to be part of the oppressors, even if they don't realize it, are fundamentally and irredeemably evil. And that the oppressed or aggrieved are like fundamentally good and pure. And you know, I would say that the alternative to that is the old Solzhenitsyn line, that the line between good and evil runs through the heart of every man, not through classes, races, or sexes. And that all people are fallen. Christians say they're all fallen. But nevertheless, I do think that what you're saying is right. There's a kind of irredeemable imputation of unconscious intentions that puts you in a no-win situation.
I think it puts all of us there.
Yeah.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You had, as I did some reading to prepare for this, you know, I just Googled some things. One of the concepts that I think you hit on when you talked about dropping the SAT standards and cultural difference and the new morality, I think is related to my question. It seemed to me that one of the sub-points of the theory is almost the same question that Pontius Pilate asked, what is truth? And so this idea that truth is relative, can you make a comment on that specifically, and how, let's just say, for example, the use of pronouns. So when I never even knew this was a thing until I went to school to study social work.
What do you want to say?
And I learned that pronouns, you know, you could kind of be whatever you want. And we were even instructed in some classes not to use pronouns. And so I understand that Webster actually changed some definitions every year. They change upwards of 500, the definition of like 500 words. So now technically, if you were to look at the dictionary, you couldn't use an argument to support what we know as truth based on the dictionary because the definition's been changed. Can you talk about the definition of truth and how that is related to what we're calling critical theory?
Yes, well, I can try. And this is the importance that I assign to the idea that this is not a postmodern doctrine, because it contains both highly moralistic and very certain understanding of how things work in the world. They're being convinced that there is covert shaping of human beings' minds by power structures that lead to these disparities. That's a truth claim about the world. It rules out other truth claims. And so it's not postmodern, and it contains a moralistic reaction to the truth claim. The moralistic reaction is not that, like, you should try harder and do better, but rather, we're gonna respect the cultural difference. And so it's both, I think, a deep truth claim about the world and a highly moralistic reaction to it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Professor Yenner. Could you help me? I gotta make sure I understand what you said when Representative Giddings asked you for your definition of critical race theory, where, at least what I wrote down, what I heard, where you said that it is an embodiment of the civil rights movement. Is that correct?
No, I would say that it reflects our current civil rights ideology, which is that all disparities, all group differences are traceable to discrimination. So think of it like this. How do we explain the gap in achievement between whites and Asians? Let's just talk about that for a second. How do we explain the gap in achievement between whites and Asians? Because Asians perform better on almost every metric of study. And we would say that the disparity between whites and Asians has to be traceable to discrimination. Okay? It's not innate differences between the groups. It's not different cultural practices and priorities. It has to be from some sort of systematic discrimination. Now, if you apply that, like using Asians and whites, like everyone scratches their heads and doesn't know exactly what to say, but the reason that's deployed is because we want to usually compare whites and blacks in America. When we say that all disparities are traceable to discrimination, when we look at the education gap, we cannot say that there are different priorities in the community, inferior priorities, or different priorities among the groups. We can only say that the gap is traceable to discrimination. And the discrimination isn't individual, it's systematic. It's a product of all of your decisions. Now, Madam Chair, there is a debate about what civil rights ideology is. Does it rule out individual discrimination, or does it open itself up to this other civil rights ideology where all disparities are traceable to discrimination? Critical theory is the latest manifestation of the idea that disparities are traceable to discrimination. But it's not the same thing as a civil rights movement. When you look at Kendi, for instance, he doesn't like the civil rights movement because he says it's individualistic and doesn't embrace the idea of group rights to the extent that needs to be done. You'll see that in all of the critical race theory stuff. They all oppose the civil rights movement and say that it was kind of weak and didn't recognize the genuine nature of the oppression that minorities suffered. So I do not equate it with the civil rights movement. They reject the civil rights movement because it's too liberal, too individualistic for them. Is that good?
Yes, thank you for that clarification.
Great, committee, any other questions for Professor Yoder?
Professor, you need to use some water. Does anyone have any water?
Let me freeze it first.
Madam Chair, I have a quick procedural question.
Ryan, go ahead with your question.
Yes, I'll continue with my question while Dr. Yanner hydrates himself. So Dr. Yanner, I've spent portions of my career trying to figure out how to get military units to abide by standards and procedures, and another portion of it digging through fire protection codes. And after a couple of administrative chapters in those documents, we get stuck on a chapter that deals with definitions. And this is kind of a follow-on to the question earlier about definitions of terms. And we seem to be losing control of that chapter in our society. And it's very Orwellian in the way that terms like diversity and inclusion and respect are, in the way they are being used by critical theories, they are very anti-diverse, they are very non-inclusive, they are very disrespectful. So if we cannot get back control of those types of definitions and how we approach this topic, is there a way for us to win in this conflict and to return society to a norm if we are automatically defined as opposing values like diversity and inclusion and respect?
Yes, thank you for that. I mean, I think this is a very complicated issue. It's a very complicated issue. I've written a couple articles on this topic. One of them is called Social Justice Newspeak. That is online somewhere. And so here's the way I try to understand that, okay? There's a lot of diversities. There's diversity of opinion, there's racial diversity, there's sexual diversity. How do you choose among the various understandings of diversity? There needs to be a higher principle that comes down and selects the understanding of diversity that we want. And for the social justice ideology, that higher principle is that understanding of the common good or social justice that I ended with. That is, it creates the selection criteria of how we're going to understand inclusion. Because that's another word that has lots of definitions. How do you select one? There needs to be one way to understand it, so it like reaches down and selects the preferred understanding of that particular concept. So, so that's why I say, ultimately, this is a debate about what the nature of a civilization is. Social justice ideology and the principles of Western civilization that have reigned, since whenever you want to say Western civilization began, are inconsistent with one another because they have different understandings of the common good and therefore embrace different understandings of these other terms, like respect and diversity and inclusion and equity. But you can't get anywhere unless you focus in on that difference on the level of the common good. So, yeah.
Great. Any other questions, committee? Okay, thank you. Brooke has a copy of House Bill 377. I'm going to ask her to go ahead and pass that out right now, so you'll have time during the break to address it.
We're going to come back. This is Pam Hippo. This is part one.
That went into law